Welcome back. We'll now go on to our next committee, which is Community and Economic Development, which is chaired by Councilmember Pinky Vargas.
Thank you, Michael. We have one item in front of us today, and I am joined by fellow council members April Barker and Roxanne Murphy. We have a summary statement that the staff will provide on the update of the assessment of fair housing, from here on called AFH process. The AFH is required by HUD to analyze how our community is doing in carrying out fair housing practices, protecting people from negative housing actions or discrimination that may occur because of their race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, family status, marital status, sexual orientation or gender identity, and or military or veteran status, and sets the goals for achieving improvements over the upcoming 5-year period. The draft AFH is open for public comment through October 16th, 2017. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for our presentation to Samuel Lutz.
Thank you, Samuel Lutz, Planning Department. Thank you for that introduction. This is a requirement based on us being an entitlement community through the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. We talked to you back in July about the Community Participation Plan, and we have followed that process in updating this fair housing assessment. The AFH lays the groundwork, among other things, for our consolidated plan update, which drafting comes on the heels of this. I also want to differentiate between the AFH and the consolidated plan, in that this is really about the protected classes that Councilmember Vargas listed off in the introduction. It's looking at how people are discriminated against here or not based on those classes and the intersection of those protected classes and income. Conversely, the consolidated plan looks at that, but primarily also much, much broader on all kinds of issues that affect low-income people throughout our community in general. So with that, I'll introduce Lisa Manos and Kate Bartholomew, who are going to give the presentation today, and then I'll come back and talk with you about the goals.
Thank you. The Federal Fair Housing Act was made federal law in 1968.
You can bring that microphone a little closer to you. There you go. Thank you.
In 1968, the Federal Fair Housing Act became federal law, which made it unlawful to refuse to sell, rent to, or negotiate with someone because of their race, gender, religion, etc. The Federal Fair Housing Act was passed 1 week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The 7 protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act are race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and in 1988 they added disability and familial status, which is having children under the age of 18 in the household or being pregnant. In the state of Washington, the following are also protected classes: marital status, sexual orientation or gender identity, and veteran or military status. And in the city of Bellingham, we also list age as a protected class. 5 years ago, Bellingham identified the impediments we saw as keeping people from accessing fair housing and developed a fair housing action plan to address those impediments. At that time, and since 1996, HUD required an analysis of impediments be done. Our number one impediment was landlords were unwilling to make reasonable accommodations on the basis of disability. This was the number one fair housing complaint identified in Bellingham, and it was also the number one fair housing complaint nationwide. Housing discrimination and housing burden disproportionately affect persons of color and the disabled. And the number 3 impediment is the public at large has limited knowledge on protected classes, fair housing laws, how to lodge a complaint, and basically the resources that are available to them. We addressed the impediments by developing a fair housing action plan, and over 5 years we distributed information packets directly to landlords and property management companies. We held a local fair housing workshop with a speaker from the Fair Housing Center of Washington. We recorded that as well and had it on BTV 10 for the public. We also provided trainings to human service providers and distributed information to the public. We targeted minority households for advertisements about the city's home rehabilitation and home buyer programs because it's shown that these groups of people are the least likely to apply for those programs. We considered adding protected classes of gender identity, creed, veterans, and use of service animals, but we didn't add them. We didn't have the capacity at the time, and we would have to enforce any additional protected classes above the federal fair housing and the state of Washington. The AFH has replaced the analysis of impediments, and as I said earlier, it's due every 5 years, requiring the city to analyze local fair housing landscape, set fair housing priorities and goals. The AFH rules identify 4 fair housing issues that program participants must assess: patterns of integration and segregation, racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, disparities in access to opportunity, and disproportionate housing needs. This is an example of an AFH map. This happens to be of Washington, D.C., and like many cities, Washington, D.C. has several areas that have racially or ethnically concentrated poverty. The colored dots on the map represent racial and ethnic groups, and the lighter gray areas indicate a higher concentration of poverty. Each of the purple outlines on the right, it's kind of hard to see there, but they indicate a racial or ethnic area of concentrated poverty. The orange dots on the other side of the map, in the dark areas, indicate a large proportion of white population living in higher income areas. This type of situation is what HUD is trying to avoid. When we look at the city of Bellingham, based on HUD's criteria and the data provided, we find, oh, I'll wait. Could you press that? Thank you. Okay. Based on HUD's criteria and the data provided, we find the city of Bellingham doesn't have any segregation nor any racially or ethnic concentrated areas of poverty, which is really good news. However, we are not without problems. The city does have areas of poverty as seen in the light gray areas on the map. However, they do not correspond with any racial or ethnic group, and unfortunately, poverty is not a protected class. Looking at Bellingham today, in both the jurisdiction and the region, and reviewing trends and demographics, we see we've slowly become more diverse. Many residents are housing cost burdened, and source of income discrimination has become an issue. One of the HUD's data tables shows a little bit about our increased diversity. In 1990, the white population was 92% of the total population in Bellingham, but in 2010, it's 82%. The Hispanic population has gone from 3% in 1990 to 8% in 2010. The Asian and Pacific Islanders have more than doubled from 2% in 1990 to 4% in 2010, and foreign-born citizens have gone from 8% to 11.5%. In looking at land use in the city of Bellingham, you can see that the majority of the residential land in the city limits is dedicated to single-family housing. All the light-colored areas. This could become a roadblock for people having a choice in their housing.
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, I came on board about the time we were really launching our public participation process, and Samia did start meeting with the Community Development Advisory Board back in December. And then we launched an online survey, which I'll go into in some detail, the results of that. And that was a big part of our community participation. But we also sent regular updates to about 170 stakeholder groups, and the list of which was helped developed by the Community Development Advisory Board. And we offered to any group that was interested, we could come and meet with them in person and have a face-to-face discussion about the AFH. And a few stakeholder groups did take us up on that. We met with Northwest Youth Services, Homeless Voices, and have had one public hearing with public housing residents at Lincoln Square, and we have another one scheduled this week in Washington Square. So a bit about the results of the Fair Housing Survey. It was open for over a month and a half, from June to July this summer. We got over 2,000 responses to the survey, which well exceeded our expectations. And there was respondents from every single neighborhood in Bellingham. Also, on top of that, respondents really mirrored the demographics of the city as a whole, which we were quite pleased about. About 80% were white, 5% were Native American, Pacific Islander, Asian, or African American. We had 12% Latino or Hispanic respondents, which is a bit higher than our actual city demographics, as well as disabled population also is a bit higher than the city's demographics. And the percentage of renters versus homeowners also was similar to the demographics of the city as a whole. So while this wasn't statistically significant, it really did reflect the entirety of the population to some extent. So I'm going to try and summarize the big themes that we heard in response to the survey. I'll note this is definitely not to scale. If it were, affordability would take up half the slide. But as Samia noted earlier, affordability really isn't a core issue of the AFH. It's really about protected classes and discrimination. However, we really felt like we could use this data still to help inform our consolidated plan going forward. So it's not a big emphasis in our draft AFH that's posted online now, but we will really take into account what we've heard in terms of the open-ended responses to the survey. Some other themes that were noteworthy, though, is about landlord and tenant education was very much, even though it was part of the goals that were implemented 5 years ago as part of the past action plan, there was still a lot of request and desire for more education, both on the part of the tenants, wanting more education about their rights and their recourse if they felt they'd been discriminated against, and also landlords themselves wanting more education for what to do and what was legally required of them. Also, working families came up a lot in relation to affordability as well, but also feeling like there was no help for working families that weren't quite a high enough poverty group or disabled, et cetera. Section 8 discrimination came up as well, and a handful of people also asking for more infill development as a possible solution to the affordability problem. Students came up a bit also. Both sides of that coin, really. There were students saying they felt discriminated against or taken advantage of as students. And there was also comments that said because of students moving into neighborhoods, they saw that as a cause or a correlation with rents becoming higher. So that was an impression. And then also jobs, the gap between job wages and the affordability. So again, as you'll see, those categories of race and ethnicity and other protected classes didn't loom large in the results. However, I did want to mention, going back to the demographics that Lisa showed you, since we are still such a majority white community, there were a few reports of legitimate discrimination based on race or disability, and since we have such a small population of foreign-born or minority groups, it's never going to be a large problem, but it is worth noting that there are a few cases where people are feeling that this is happening to them. So I want to take a moment to clarify what is and isn't housing discrimination, because there's a difference between feeling discriminated against and actually that counting towards discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. So it's any act, omission, or decision taken to restrict access or availability of housing based on one of those 10 protected classes we listed above. But there are a few gray areas. Owner-occupied buildings of 4 units or less are exempt from the Fair Housing Act, as are single-family residences, unless they're publicly advertised. So there's a few places where the fair housing laws don't apply. However, in our survey results, we asked people where and whom discriminated against them, and most of those said they were in apartment buildings or by landlords or property managers. So it didn't seem like the majority of the cases were falling maybe into these gray area categories, but it is worth noting. So I also want to mention that, so I'll jump into the results, which were that 17% of the respondents to our survey reported experiencing housing discrimination. But to note that that just includes people who are self-reporting discrimination. It may not, for example, if you feel discriminated against because you're a student, that doesn't count because students aren't protected classes under the Fair Housing Act currently. So these numbers might be a bit inflated, but this is how many people reported feeling they had experienced housing discrimination. It's just an important note. 84% of those felt they'd been discriminated against, as I said, by a landlord or property manager. But the vast majority, 93%, said they did not report discrimination to anyone. The number one reason for that was that they didn't believe it makes any difference. And the second reason was that they didn't know where to report discrimination. So those were really interesting findings, and we really took that to heart when designing our goals. And Samuel will then discuss the goals that we've developed coming out of the information gathered.
So those of you who were at the committee earlier this morning will hear an echo for some of that information. We've really tried to align with other city processes going on here. So goal 1 is about implementing adopted city policies through appropriate development regulations that expand housing choice. Goal 2 is about looking at adding protections for people who face housing discrimination. So these go back to those issues about source of income discrimination and that kind of thing, as well as examining where we can have more housing choice throughout our communities, as well as in the details of the goals you can see in the plan that you have and that's posted online, continuing to support additional rental housing development through the levy. A lot of people just really found more housing choice means we need more units in our community. And while that doesn't get specifically to the protected classes, it benefits everyone, obviously. So goal 3 is about providing additional education, as we've talked about, and this is both, again, to property managers, owners, and tenants, both about fair housing laws and discrimination. And then at the public hearing we held at the CDAB meeting, folks asked that we include just some basic information about the State Landlord-Tenant Act, so to give people more access to all the kinds of information that could help them. And then lastly, supporting households through case managers, housing case managers, landlord liaisons, the types of things that we're able to do right now through both levy funding and general fund funding and some of our CDBG funding right now that really goes to advocate for those who need some help advocating on their own behalf and being a bit of a liaison between the landlord community and that tenant community. So the draft plan has more details in these areas. It's in your packet, I think starting on page 104 is all of this information. It's still open for public comment through the middle of this month, after which time it'll be submitted to HUD, and we're happy to take any questions.
April.
Yeah, can we go back to the map that was talking about race across Bellingham, race and ethnicity?
The Bellingham one.
Yeah. So I'm interested because sometimes data can show you some things depending on how you unpack it. And anecdotally, because I work in the schools, I mean, I see entire buses in a predominantly white community of children of color coming into a school, so they're living very close to somewhere. And because our numbers are so small, with the way that we're having to take the information from the census data, can we really pick it apart enough to say, do we have discrimination in Bellingham of housing that's more disproportionately toward people of color that are low income? And I'm just concerned just because of what I know, especially within my ward and area, that I just wonder if we can even do that with how low in numbers that we have.
Yeah, it is difficult, and HUD's requirements are quite prescriptive in terms of us using their table and their data. This is the first, we're using the first rollout. We're one of the first communities to do this new AFH process, so they've already started improving it, but we're kind of locked into when we started using their data. We are looking at other sources of data for our consolidated plan to get more into the neighborhood levels as much as we can. But for right now, this is what we have. Do you have anything to add?
For
Kate?
us, just a second, I would love for us to, I know that we have access and we have to be very careful with the data and how we share it, but we do now have access with the public schools and where our children are living, young families with young children are living. And I think if you really picked that out and looked at it, you would see apartment complexes, other areas that are predominantly people of color living in poverty in Bellingham. And so I really want to be careful as we put this information out there, because we need to really, we need to be very clear that it is very limited in the data that we're receiving and then putting out here. So for people to come to conclusions on this, I get that we're doing it and we have to do it because it's a requirement. We have to do it in a specific way, but I don't think that that tells a really true picture of Bellingham.
Yeah, they give us a certain criteria for defining a racially and ethnically concentrated area of poverty and it's based on census blocks, I believe. But they also have the opportunity to add local data into our report to the extent we're able to get it. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
I want to say that this report was fascinating. It's very extensive. There's a lot of really great information on here. It's going to be very helpful in regards to us addressing our housing challenges and affordability, et cetera. And I think you did a great job of reaching unrepresented groups. So this was very extensive. I am curious, when people would say that they didn't know where to report discrimination, et cetera, do we send information back to them and tell them where they can do that?
That's certainly part of the plans for our education, is to really highlight those issues and focus on those issues about how to report and what happens when you report.
Okay. And I will say at the end of the survey, we did have information about how to contact the Fair Housing Center of Washington, which is the authority.
Okay. That's great. Committee members, any other? April and then Terry.
Sorry.
Still on the committee. So when you go back to this is a great opportunity to educate people on fair housing and where it is and where it's not applicable. So you had a slide that said single-family residences and under 4 apartment complexes.
Oh, yes.
Yellow.
Let me go forward to that.
There it is.
So can you be more specific? Because what I heard, which I don't think is true, is that people that have 4 or less units in one housing complex or a single-family home, they're not required.
If it's owner occupied. So if you have a 4-plex, to my understanding, and you lived in one of those units, you would not have to comply with the Fair Housing Act.
Meaning you could discriminate based on somebody's color?
I believe.
Unless it's publicly advertised.
Right.
So if you put it on Craigslist, you're caught, but
Correct.
if you just circulate it amongst your friends, you can do that?
Word of mouth. You could say to your friends, I don't want to rent to someone because they have children or something.
Yeah.
You could legally do that. You can't say on Craigslist, no children or something.
Okay. And when you say single-family home, so we have several different definitions on that. So are we just saying single-family detached home or anything under 4 units?
I believe that's a single-family
Okay.
home. I don't know if it's detached or not.
Wow.
It is detached.
Detached.
Like a single-family home. If you wanted to rent out a room in your basement, but you
Okay.
didn't want, a single woman didn't want to rent to a man or a group of people, younger people, and so I think that's why they haven't. Sorry. I think that part of it is because if you in your own home wanted to rent out a room, I don't think the idea is that you can discriminate blatantly, although they can't stop it. But it would be like if you were a single woman with children and you did not want to rent to a man in your home, or young people or whatever, you're allowed in your own home to do what you need to do as far as this goes.
Yeah, it just struck me because I thought I heard that, and I'm glad that you brought that forward because we have huge areas in Bellingham where all you can have is a single-family home. So technically, if they were owner-occupied, you could have huge areas where you could discriminate freely against people. Okay, thank you.
Terry?
Yeah, I thought the report was really well done.
Yeah.
Glad of the outreach with it. Glad to see some of the statistics here, which were, I thought, quite enlightening. I was glad to hear that Bellingham doesn't have segregation, even though some have been stating that single family is racially segregating. And so I'm glad to hear that statement, which we knew was erroneous. But what I found interesting is the breakdowns on some of the different neighborhoods on the amount of rentals in single-family neighborhoods for older neighborhoods as opposed to some of the other neighborhoods like the Edgemore neighborhood that has 2%, even though they have it's all single family, but only 2% rentals in it, or Silver Beach and Samish, both having very high elements of single family, but 80% owner occupied. So which ones have the diversity and mix and are taking those different types of housing? So I thought that was very interesting from you. Thank you.
Thank you. One additional question. I know that it is not under HUD in regards to students or pets, but this is in the report about discrimination, and I'm wondering as a city if there's anything that we can do. I guess we can't be involved, or those kinds of things of discrimination we can't do anything about for students or pets. Or
For pets, there's a lot of questions about that, and I think we'd like to bring some professionals in to talk about the difference between service animals and pets and those kinds of things, because there are a lot of nuances there to the law, and so that's another area that we targeted for education.
okay. Committee members, any additional questions?
Yeah, I have another one. As you go further, I don't know how much further you'll go in this report, but especially with the consolidated plan, there was some breakup of certainly the types of neighborhoods and what's available, and I appreciate the goal that said, we should have diverse housing types throughout where people can attain and live near each other even if they're not in the same income level. It would be very interesting, especially as you find other local data sources, to look in our truly multifamily areas and then those single-family areas and determine the ones that are actually part of the discrimination process. So those fit things like color, ethnicity, age, all of those things. Breaking it down into that truly multifamily, the bigger the high-rise, and then the more single-family. I would like to know if there's any distinction there, because we're using words like erroneous, but I think my understanding is what we're saying is that the data that we have at the census level and how they're putting this together is just how we have to put it together, but it's not as clear as it could be.
Yeah, and we do have data on complaints that have been submitted to HUD, and we did look at those. Unfortunately, most of them are dismissed for one reason or another, and I don't think we have people's addresses who make those complaints to be able to make those kind of correlations. But we certainly want to look deeper into the neighborhood level like you're suggesting, and I made a note of that.
Yeah, I think really understanding that data based on will help us in determining housing choice. And if there is any, if people are living low income mostly in one area, and then if that is also concentrating people of color in those areas, would be, I think, interesting. And especially because in here it was talking about, was it Latino or Hispanic single mothers, like more likely to have housing discrimination, some of those things. So I think if we could get the school data, even though you might not be able to show it on a map, but to help inform, we may see that parents of young children, we may see that they're more concentrated in areas, and I think that would be really important for us to look at housing styles and choices for people to live throughout the entire city and not only concentrated in certain areas.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's Hispanic households are disproportionately more likely to be cost burdened.
Cost burdened.
So not necessarily discriminated against, but have a higher likelihood of being cost burdened, and single mothers or single parent households have a much higher rate of poverty.
Poverty, so more likely to live in, yeah, lower income housing unit styles. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Samia, Lisa, and Kate. Any final comments? No? Okay, so this was for information only and a committee.
Okay.